If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. In this episode, Corbin and I are joined by Dr. Alan Reznik, a board-certified orthopedic surgeon specializing in arthroscopic surgery and sports medicine. Connecticut Magazine has named him a top doc for more than 2 decades. He is also recognized as one of America's top physicians by the Consumers Research Council of America. Dr. Reznik has served as team physician for the U.S. Tennis Open and the New Haven Knights professional hockey team. Widely published with over 60 journal articles, Dr. Reznik is the author of I've Fallen and I Can Get Up, a guide to fall risk and prevention, and his recent book, The Knee and Shoulder Handbook, the keys to a pain-free active life. So, Dr. Reznik, welcome to the Aging Well podcast. Let's begin by having you talk a little bit about yourself and also how you came to specializing in orthopedics.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's always a good opportunity to talk to the audience about stuff. I came to orthopedics from engineering. Actually, I was a chemical engineering student, and I was working at Columbia. Had no money at the time, so I had a work-study job, and I had like 2 or 3 jobs in the summer, and struggling. And I ended up landing this job at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, being the engineering student working on a project involving sudden infant death syndrome, which was crib death many years ago. Many of your listeners might remember the babies would die suddenly and no one knew anything about it. And in that engineering project, there was computers and other things to do in engineering, but there was a lot of medicine. And the doctors working on the project came to me one day and they said, we think you should apply to medical school. And I said, why? We think you'd be a particularly good doctor. And I was taken back a bit because the way I grew up, I never thought that was in the realm of possibilities for me. And I had no idea what my standings would be because engineers didn't really apply to medical school then. It was very, very few. I think there were 10 in my whole class of engineering school that applied. And so when I got accepted to Yale for medical school, I said, oh my God, I guess I need to go. I can't turn that down. So I went to Yale, and then being an engineer, the mechanics of orthopedics, and I had also taught, my father was an engineer and also did wood crafting and wood stuff. He was like a master carpenter at night. He did projects for people. And I learned some things, and I taught wood shop as a kid, as camps and things, because I knew this stuff. So between my experience with woodworking and engineering, orthopedics was like a natural. And then once I got into orthopedics, this thing called arthroscopy was starting. We're looking inside joints with this fiber optic telescope. And you do these things microscopically and minimally invasively. And that got fascinating to me. So between the mechanics of the ligaments and how knees and shoulders work and all the other things, I ended up doing a weird practice. I had level 1 trauma, general orthopedics. At that time, there were no pediatric orthopedic surgeons. So I took care of kids with club feet and all kinds of things. And then I did this infancy thing of arthroscopy where you're doing shoulder and knee repairs, and there was no instruments. So I actually invented some of the instruments. They're actually being used today. It's kind of nice. I have now 8 patents in total. And to me, the funny thing is my son said to me one day, he said, Dad, he doesn't want to be a doctor. He was going to be a chemist. He says, if I make one molecule and help someone with cancer, I can help thousands of people at once. He says, you only help one person at a time. So I was already teaching orthopedics to medical students and residents, but I took that to heart and I said, how can I reach more people and, put my knowledge together in a book and make it available in a way that people could use it. So the book, the Knee and Shoulder Handbook, Key to a Pain-Free and Active Life, is really about having a conversation with you about your problem. So I try to write it as if you're having an office visit with me in that kind of tone that's understandable, but I try to write it accurate enough that an orthopedic resident, a medical student, a PA could pick it up and actually learn something important they could use in their daily career. So I try to bridge that gap for people, and that's where we are.
That's a fascinating path to med school. I often push that I think almost all doctors should go through an exercise science degree, because they understand more the preventative side. But I hadn't given much thought to the idea of the orthopedic is really an advanced engineer that's kind of taking those engineering skills and applying them to the human body and to movement. And I think we often kind of go the wrong pathways to medicine. When we talk about chemistry or biology as those primary pathways, because we're not understanding the mechanics and the physiology of the body. And in my teaching, I've kind of adopted this idea that the solution to all these health issues and medical problems and things are, I kind of took I've heard it biopsychosocial, and our biomechanist last year was like, wait a minute, it's also biomechanical psychosocial. It's like, that's very true. And so, our approach, I think, on this podcast, as well as what I teach in exercise science and what I think medicine should be, is that kind of four focus aspect of the practice. So I think that's fascinating, and I'm going to keep that in mind as I'm pushing people toward med school. Engineering is another pathway toward that.
No, it is, and the other thing that people underappreciated is that I actually was dyslexic too. On top of that, didn't know it. And, I was in engineering school. I had no idea because I rarely worried about spelling things. I was more worried about the calculus and finite analysis and all the computer stuff. And my English requirements were limited, but at Columbia, Columbia University, they had a lot of civilization requirements and all these classic classes that I had to take anyway. And I struggled through those, but it was great for me. At the end of the day, the understanding of engineering and medicine changed the way I studied for things. And it changed my perspective. So there were a lot of things that I had found incredibly easy in medical school that everyone struggled with, and other things I found much more difficult than everyone else, and they didn't struggle with. And the difference was, for me, was if I could understand how the heart works as a pump, for example. When babies have all kinds of cardiac anomalies, there's different blood pressures in each arm and each leg. And there was this whole thing about trying to figure out what's wrong with the heart by taking blood pressures all over the body. And that's just a sophisticated pump system with a bad valve, right? So to me, I never memorized that. I always knew how to figure it out. To me, it was an engineering puzzle, right? And that was, relative to some of the other things I'd done in engineering school, relatively trivial. And I remember all my classmates struggling crazily to memorize the patterns so they could recognize the pattern of the blood pressures that made sense for the valve problem. And so things like that were very good. The kidney is really a chemical plant that does ultrafiltration. The lungs is an oxygen transfer facility. The brain is really a giant, very sophisticated, complex computer that we're first figuring out now with AI. And there's ethical considerations about all that too. We could talk about it another show if you want. I've written a bunch of articles about that. But anyway, so at the end of the day, the engineering aspect for me gives me a different approach for that stuff. And that's also then comes to invention, right? Like, oh, gee, this piece of equipment could be better. Let me see if I can figure out. Go to my first invention. I went to a marine shop and I had them make me the thing. And they had no idea it was for a person. So they said they knew it was for a person. Like, I'm very afraid it wouldn't be strong enough. So they made it out of double wall steel tubing and could barely pick it up. It was too heavy. And when I finally made the final product, I said, listen, we got to do aluminum tubes, and it's, 1/8 the weight of the other one, the first one ever made. And a small nurse can pick it up and bring it into the operating room. It's okay. So, little things like that. It's so interesting.
That's cool.
Yeah. So anyway, we could talk about specifically more things, we could talk specifically about, knee injuries, water on the knee, how you get that, what that means, shoulder injuries, how do you know when to go to the doctor? We could talk about those kinds of things. I think the starting point for a lot of people is, I've hurt myself. I don't know what to do next.
What would you do next?
What would you do next?
Yeah, what would you do next?
I left that open. So, I think the first thing, most people, and again, depending on your age, the severity of the injury, most things, it's a bump on my knee. It's not a big deal. you don't really have much difficulty. In 3 to 5 days, it's gone. It's not a problem. And I always joke that, the younger you are, the quicker that 3 to 5 days comes. Sometimes it's really 2 days when you're really young, and when you're older, it might be a week. But, the average person, 3 to 5 days, it's better. And sometimes you have a bruise. I did a house call last night. It's actually a distant cousin of mine who's preparing to go to a trip to Patagonia, and she's in her 80s, and she fell. And she's got the trip in 2 weeks. She's very concerned about whether or not she could go on her trip. And the simple thing was, I walked in the house for the house call, as a favor, because she was panicking about it. She'd already been to a walk-in and had an x-ray, didn't know what to do. And she walked down the stairs unaided with no handrails. I said, okay. I said to her, I said, listen, you passed my first test. You walk downstairs unaided with no handrails. You didn't really break anything inside your knee, because you wouldn't be able to do that. That was a simple thing. So if you could manage stairs without using your hands, chances that you have something serious in your knee acutely right after the injury, is very low, right? On the other hand, if you can't, and the knee swells every time you bend, or it catches and pops and locks, well, then maybe there's something inside that's a problem. And then water on the knee is an interesting symptom. When you get water on the knee, you say that, well, why do I have it? So the body can do two things when it's really mad at you. It can either hurt or make fluid or swell, right? Because it really doesn't have a lot of other choices, right? It's your systems can't complain in any other way. So the swelling is really about inflammation. The lining tissue makes fluid to try to lubricate the joint. And that lubrication can help lavage away, if you will, or, spread away, any evil factors that might be in your knee. Or it could just be trying to lubricate something that's not working right, because it thinks that by adding fluid, it'll work better. But a lot of weird things happen. So the fluid itself turns your quads off, and it also makes your knee harder to bend. So, turning your quads off decreases the stress on the knee, and making it not bend as much takes away an irritation. So those things happen. And then the question is it because I tore my ACL or I tore a big ligament in my knee, or I chipped the cartilage badly and now a piece of bone is floating? And when in fact the fluid is blood, because I bled into my knee? That would happen relatively quickly. Usually an ACL starts to swell within 4 hours of the injury. Or is it, I dinged up the cartilage, I have a torn meniscus. Meniscus is not vascular at that place, so it's not going to bleed. But my body recognizes the mechanical irritant, and I'm just making clear synovial fluid to lubricate myself. That would be another thing, right? And the last one is I have a chemical problem, like I have gout, or I have rheumatoid arthritis, or I have Lyme disease, or some other agent that has now caused a specific inflammatory response. And when that happens, the knee is swollen for a different reason, and then the treatment might be medical. So that's kind of the spectrum of swollen knee. So you have to sort out right away, is this an acute traumatic injury where there's something broken, torn, or chipped inside the knee? Is this something where it's acute traumatic, where there's something just mechanically not right and it's not going to bleed, but it'll swell later and it'll keep swelling if you keep using it? Or is this something that, I need to see the doctor because I have Lyme disease and I need that treated? Because, Lyme disease is 3 steps. The first step is the bite with the rash. The second step, and most ticks things are a little bit like this, then it goes away. And then the next one is a joint that's involved. It could be a knee, it could be any joint, but more often knee than others. And then the last thing is central nervous system and cardiac and vascular, and all kinds of problems that are serious. And people have died from tertiary Lyme, because the third stage of Lyme involves your whole body, and it's very bad. And some people present even with a seizure, and they don't even know that the seizure is because the brain is involved with Lyme disease. So Lyme is relatively serious. You don't make that diagnosis early and don't treat the knee one, you end up with the third one, which is very serious. So people like, my Lyme went away, my knee swelling went away. I didn't come back for my follow-up. I said, wait a minute, come back for your follow-up. You don't want to get, you have Lyme, you never got treated. You don't want to get tertiary Lyme, because that's very serious. And people have a misconception about that. I had one patient told me that about 2 months ago. The knee swelling went away, so I figured I have to come back. It's like, no, that's bad. It's really bad, because now Lyme is dormant. It's going to come back later, just like shingles does, those kinds of things. Anyway, so that's the first step.
So a goal of this podcast is to help people age well. And so aging well implies kind of healthy, being injury-free. And an obvious goal of aging well is to avoid seeing doctors like yourself. And I know you make a business of seeing people that are injured, but I know you also likely don't want to see patients if you don't have to. So what are some recommendations for active individuals to help their joints age well?
Okay, this is the perfect question. I like to say that, and for this group, you'll understand the analogy. You could drive like Mario Andretti, you can drive like my grandmother. Those people remember Mario Andretti pretty well. He needed new tires every 250 miles, right? So life, I always like to say life is someplace between Mario Andretti and my grandmother. And so if you have an active lifestyle and you're in a nice balance, likely that is going to be excellent. Some people have an active lifestyle and are out of balance. That may not be so good. Either they're so active on the weekends and do nothing, or they're so active that they insist on continuing hurt. And so I think the first thing is it's important to be active. I think the physiology of your body is you need to have some activity every day. Even 20 minutes of walking every day, if that's the minimum, that's been shown to have huge benefits, cardiac, mental, everything. I mean, just even something simple as taking a 20-minute walk every day is well worth it. And then know your own body. If you have a bad knee and it swells every time you go out and run, well, maybe running isn't the right thing for you. And you maybe should switch to biking and swimming and see how you do with that, or maybe elliptical or something that's non-impact. I love it when I see people in the gym, I'm being sarcastic for a minute, that when you hear them on the treadmill, it sounds like earthquake after earthquake. It's bam, 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 bam. And you hear that for 30, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. They're an hour. They're bamming away like crazy. The whole gym can hear it. The room is shaking, right? And you hear someone else next to them. It's whoosh, 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 whoosh. What's the difference between those two people? And there's a lot of reasons. Some people have very tight hamstrings, and when they come down, their heel strike is crazy hard, and they need to work on that. Some people are just set the treadmill much faster than they can really run. And they're forced to hit the treadmill very hard because they're falling forward so quickly that there's nothing else they can do. And those people can have joint problems. If I took a hammer and hit your knee with it at that force every day, for an hour, you'd say, are you crazy? Right? You would not be happy about that. So I always like to tell people, like, when they're doing this stuff, what are the stress points? Can we figure out ways to reduce those stress points? Can you do it in a way that's smooth and comfortable? And I think that's important. So, some exercise every day of some type, even if it's a short walk, doing it in a comfortable zone, being sensitive that you're not hurting yourself while you're doing it. That's going to be the key to everything.
Right.
Even with the best intentions, active individuals are likely to experience some injuries in their lifetime. What are some of the most common injuries that you see with your active aging adults?
Yeah, they're the common things. Knee is very common, and shoulder very common. I mean, someone has a chronic shoulder problem, and so two things you see a lot of. I see bursitis and tendonitis everywhere. People overdo their tennis and they have a very quick whip with their wrist, and they get tennis elbow, or they get pickleball elbow now because that's so popular, or golfer's elbow is the other side of the elbow. Again, like an overuse result or poor technique. Rotator cuff problems, you see people have all kinds of issues with rotator cuff. Weightlifters get problems with their AC joint, and that causes impingement and tendonitis and irritation. And then people have kneecap problems. They do a lot of squatting and kneeling their whole life, and the kneecap starts to wear out. So those are the common things I see a lot of. And then things like gout and mild inflammatory arthropathies, you see a lot of that too. So all those are the most common things.
I can attest to the shoulder issues. One of my biggest challenges being over the age of 60 is lifting weights with shoulder pain. I have a type 3 acromion, which I know you know what that is, but many of the listeners might not. That's where it has a significant hook into it. And you're just much more prone to compression of the shoulder structures. And so I ended up having rotator cuff surgery about 20 years ago. And I pride myself on impeccable form when I lift. So the wear and tear was just naturally because of my body structure. And I probably would have torn my rotator cuff much earlier in life had I been much more active, if I had done sports that were like throwing motions, a lot of overhead motions and things like that. So what recommendations do you have for somebody like me when it comes to some of those inherent structural issues that we might have that we might not be aware of, but can lead to bigger issues down the road?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because certainly, so focus on the shoulder one first, since you brought that up. It's interesting. I see people do exercises that I know are stressful to the shoulder in poor form. So I think your first statement is great. Form is really, really important. I think the second thing people don't respect or realize is that we're different than most other animals in that we are really designed to do things in front of our face. And I came up with this a few years ago, and there's more details about things like this in the book. But after seeing people for all these years, I said, like, how do I explain to someone how to know when an exercise is going to be good or not for them? And posture issues and rhomboids and all sorts of stuff aside, we could talk about that separately. It's really like, if you can see your hands when you're doing the exercise, it's probably better for your shoulder. So all the things that people do where they pick up something and pull it down behind their neck, or they do a pec deck where they go all the way back and their hands are out of their visual field. All those things tend to stress the shoulder more. So I said, as soon as you have a shoulder problem, if you can imagine doing weights and everything else where you could see your hands, like a short arc rotation, a lat pull down where you're pulling it down in a way that you see the full arc in front of you. So it's not the entire all the way up over your head and all the way down below your waist. It's that mid arc that's a little safer, right? Actually, the lower half even better. The lower half of that mid arc is even better. Things like backstroke and butterfly tend to really kill shoulders for swimmers. Almost all the swimmers I come in with shoulder problems are either backstroke or butterfly. And the telephone now is the big thing. Everyone's on their phone. That tends to tighten up your pecs and roll your shoulders forward. And as you know, if you have a type 3 acromion, your acromion is already hooked down. If I roll my shoulder forward, I close it down even more. And even the listeners today can do this at home. It's so easy. Imagine rolling your shoulders forward as far as you can, making yourself arched over, and raise your arm up as high as you can, just while you're listening right now, and see how high your hand goes. And now sit up straighter. What I like to say, put your sternum to the sun, pull your shoulders back, and now raise your arm up and see how much higher you can go. And you'll see there's a giant difference. So you imagine if you're in the gym and you're doing overhead exercise and you're in the telephone position, you're on your cell phone first for 4 minutes, then you get there and you come and you're still all curled over like you're on your cell phone and you do the exercise, you're in trouble, right? But if you work on your posture first, get your rhomboids back, get your chest up, get your posture straight, and then do the exercise, you're going to have a lot less trouble with your shoulders. So that probably caught up half of my office visits just now, but that's sort of the idea. But the idea of I could never really explain that to anyone. It was so hard for me to figure that out. Like, how do I tell someone this simple idea? And then I realized, well, people do everything with their hands in front of their eyes. And that's how we're built. We're not like monkeys. We're not designed to hang from trees. We're designed to do stuff in front of our eyes. We're really very, very dexterous and manual, and our eyes are super focused. And so the weightlifting where your hands go out of that field, that's not actually what we're designed for. So it's interesting, in and of itself.
I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging. That's fascinating. You've just informed my instruction as an exercise science professor now in talking about different exercises and just that simple tip. Because one thing that I've shifted to in probably the last year or two has been going from a back squat to a Zercher squat. If you're familiar with that, that's where you hold the bar in the crux of the arm in front of you. And again, the hands are now in front of my face. But I find that I can get deeper. I can lift more weight. I have no shoulder pain, and it's actually improved my posture significantly because I'm pulling back with the rhomboids and the posterior shoulders to kind of keep that bar in position. And it makes a lot better sense now. So
it's perfect. It's perfect. I can't believe that feeds right in. That's really great. I think the other thing I like to tell people is, the Hummer, right? You got the Hummer, and then if you remember the Pinto or the Vega or, the little cars or Mini Cooper, right? So I say to people, most of your life you do so much stuff in front of you with that's pulling with your pecs and everything else, that you have either Hummers in the front and Mini Coopers in the back, and the Mini Coopers never win, And so the more you can do to get the rhomboids to work properly, the better posture you have, better form you have, and the less shoulder trouble you tend to have if the rhomboids are working well. Now, the other one I wanted to mention, because you mentioned deformity, things that you don't know about that you're born with, people are either knock-kneed or bow-legged, right? And there's a whole section in the book about that and what you can do for it. And some is so severe, you actually have to cut the bone and correct it. There are people coming generally bow-legged. They're so bad that we know they're going to get advanced arthritis as they get older because the bow is so great. And it's a structural problem, right? If you bowed in so much, all the load is only half your knee, right? Or if you bowed in or bowed out, whatever it might be, the one side of the knee is getting all the load, the other side's not. So those people tend to get arthritis later in life. And as soon as they get into trouble, we talk about doing things when they're younger called the osteotomy, correct the alignment. When you're older, maybe a partial knee replacement or a knee replacement. But if you said, what's prevention? If you're very bow-legged or knock-kneed and it's becoming a problem, and then all your aunts, people come in, oh yeah, my aunt and my uncle, they all have total knee replacements and they all look like me. Yeah, right, because you have congenital bowing, and maybe we could correct that when you're younger and get you straighter, and then that would be, it's a bit of a leap to do that. Not everyone wants to do it, so you can do other things like bracing and change their exercise mode. But that's something to think about when you're talking about prevention. It's an interesting thing. Or the people who chronically dislocate their kneecap, who could do something for that. There's a lot of things that we could do to prevent longer term problems by fixing chronic things that are congenital. You're born that way. It's going to keep bothering you no matter what we do.
Yeah. Well, I would also add that in addition to tears to the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, I also ruptured my biceps tendon with that surgery. And it was in part due to the fact that because I went to an orthopedic doctor, wasn't necessarily my first choice. He was in the office of kind of the best shoulder guy in Holland, Michigan. But when I went to him, he refused to listen to what I told him was going on with the shoulder. Despite telling him how the injury occurred, it actually occurred doing hammer curls, regular bicep curls. And I explained to him that I taught anatomy, so I understood the structure of the shoulder. In fact, I had just taught it that week.
Oh, geez.
and 4 times I told him I taught anatomy and I understood what was going on. I was trying to explain to him my understanding of what was happening to the injury. He just kept dismissing it and just told me that there was nothing wrong with the biceps tendon. It was all the rotator cuff. And so against my better judgment, after about 2 weeks of doing the rotator cuff exercises and it wasn't helping, I allowed him to give me a cortisone shot, and that really didn't help. And in fact, shortly after, it was about a week after having the injection, I was my son was just a toddler at the time. This was about, again, 20 years ago. It's less than 20 years ago because he's 18 now, but he was kind of learning to walk, and I went to pick him up and he kind of started to fall backwards, and I had to kind of lunge forward to grab him. And I felt this pop in my shoulder. And suddenly now that shoulder pain had relieved itself. But as I walked by a mirror, it was summertime. I didn't have a shirt on. I was like, I ruptured my biceps tendon. And fortunately, after that, kind of a long story short, I was able to find a better orthopedic surgeon in the area, and he was fantastic. I was able to get in to see him Monday morning, and he said, "Yep, we need to schedule an MRI," and scheduled the MRI. Called me later in the week with the results and said, we got to talk about surgery. Got me in, did the surgery, and everything went great from there. It was great recovery. But my question is kind of what recommendations do you have for patients who are looking to find a sports medicine doctor?
That's a tough one. First, let me tell you what I've learned over the years, because I think you'll find this interesting vis-a-vis your story. I've learned that if I let my patient talk for 5 more minutes, not 5 more minutes even, sometimes it's 90 seconds. It's not a lot of time. If I let my patient talk and just really listen, they'll tell me what's wrong with them, regardless of whether they know anatomy or not. They often don't know what they're describing, but with my experience, I understand what they're trying to say, even if they don't know how to say it. So you were being very exacting. And that might have put him off a bit, because I have a lot of people come in with ideas that I know are completely wrong, but I still let them tell me. for two reasons. One, sometimes even though their idea might be wrong, there might be some kernel in there of something that leads me to the truth of what's really going on with them. So I'm looking for that little kernel of truth. And the other thing is that people want to be listened to in a way. They want to be heard, and their confidence in me goes down if I don't listen to them. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I mean, I know that. It's a thing that's important in healing. I find that, patients need to know that, number one, you care, and number two, you're listening, right? And number three, you're really good at what you do, and it may even be in that order, because you could be less good and listen and really care, and people will get a better result. Because you're listening will help you get a better diagnosis, and really caring will push you the extra mile to do things when things aren't going right. I think I spend much more time on people with complications of things, and you can't help it. Everything you do has some risk of complications. Someone says to me, like, well, if it's 95% successful, what happens to the 5%? I said, well, they're 100% unhappy, right?
Yeah.
Right? They're not 95% happy. They're 100% unhappy. They're in the 5%. So the unhappy patients, I spend a lot more energy trying to get them happy again, trying to deal with the complication and solving that problem. And many of them are completely solvable, but it just takes time. But the effort to do that is that caring. You got to care about that. So, it's hard and harder these days with the pressure that doctors are under. And I'm going to give a little empathy to the doctor side of this for a second, because I feel it every day. We are pelted with computers. You got to talk to the computer. You got to put it in the computer. Down in the computer, it didn't happen. There's all this stuff. And the computer programs are not user-friendly at all. They were made based on really antiquated programs from years and years ago. I laughed with a friend. I said, you pick up the iPhone or the Google phone, right, the Pixel, and you look at it. How many apps are there? 2 million, 3 million? They all work, right? And I would say 97% of them are intuitive. You pick it up and you know what to do immediately. There isn't a single medical record program made that you can open it up and intuitively know what to do and actually have it work. We're changing computer systems coming up, and they've already told me that I have to book off at least 14 hours for training so I can learn how to use the system. And the staff needs a full week. It's an absolute economic disaster to switch systems. The amount of hours that you have to spend playing with it after you see the patient is crazy. I'll see you for 5 minutes. I got to do 15 minutes of work when you leave, and 5 minutes of work before you come, just to make the computer happy. So we're under a tremendous amount of stress to keep the volume of patients up, because we're not getting paid as well, and play with a computer system which is not user friendly. And it really takes away our ability to be our patient contact ability. Like, some people even have the computer in the room, which I refuse to do, because it saves time. I can put it in as you're telling me what the computer needs. And I find that I'm not really listening to you as much. So I go with a piece of paper like the old days, and I look you in the eye and I listen to you, and I write some stuff down. Then I go out and then I play with the computer for 20 minutes, check your x-ray, come back. People want to know why the office visit's so long, right? So yeah, I think the doctors are under tremendous pressure now to comply with all these regulations. And, some of it's from Obamacare, some of it's managed care. There's a thing in the news now that the Advantage plans are denying standard. I don't know if you saw that in the nightly news this week, but they had a whole thing that you go into this Advantage plan and you get a free gym membership and you get a dental cleaning and 2 pairs of glasses. But it turns out that they're allowed to deny care. So you go in the doctor, and the doctor says you need 3 weeks of therapy or 6 weeks of physical therapy, and they give you 2 visits and let you do it at home because they won't approve anymore. And people understand you have the insurance for the stuff you need when you're ill, not for the free glasses and the gym membership. Your health insurance is not really for that. It's very cheap to have a gym membership. I don't want to trade having a surgery I need and having to fight for 3 months to get it with the insurance company for a gym membership. Would you? For $10 a month, I don't want to fight for that.
Yeah.
And people do it all the time. I have the best health plan in the world. I have free gym membership and I go to silver this and that. Well, yeah, it costs you $100 a year to do that. And you just lost probably $7,000 of benefits in your health plan for doing that. And I think that's first coming to the surface now, because there's some small hospitals closing because of it. There was just on like the major national news, a bunch of hospitals in the middle, small towns, they're closing because the Advantage Care plans are basically putting them out of business. They're not approving things that are required for the patients. So I think there's so many pressures on the physicians now between dealing with the managed care plans and the patients and the computers. It's very hard to be the Marcus Welby that we used to be. And I love that romantic ideal, and I try to stick to it as best I can, even in this environment. And there are other guys who are like that too. You just, got to find someone you're comfortable with. That's why I say you got to find someone who's good, has got a good reputation, technically good, and you're comfortable with them as a person. Problem is, it's hard and hard to find that because of the external pressures on physicians.
Yes. Also, in your opinion, what is the importance of seeking a sports medicine orthopedic in particular when it comes to a lot of these injuries?
Yeah. So a little bit of a mixed bag on that opinion. So you want someone who's going to look at you holistically, and sports medicine for some of these things is the person who has that kind of experience. But a very good general orthopedics, we train in all the parts of the body. When you go through a general orthopedic residency, you do everything. The issue today is that some things have become more and more technical. The actual procedure, like rotator cuff, highly technical now. Arthroscopic, ligament reconstructions in the knee, very technical. Hip arthroscopy, which I don't do anymore, but there's a guy in our group who does a lot of them. Has become more technical and a lot more things you can do. So what ends up happening is that it's become more fragmented, your care. But most orthopedic surgeons can direct you if it's not something in their wheelhouse, right? Like I'm in a large group. We got 65 orthopedic surgeons, Connecticut Orthopedics. It's a big merger of a lot of different groups together, again, to deal with the insurance companies and the computer systems, because no one can afford to do it on their own. And we have so many guys who are hyper specialized in our group now that, we cross refer all the time. Oh, by the way, you need this special kind of reverse shoulder replacement. And there's a guy in our group does a lot of them, and I'm going to send you to him because he does it 3 times a week, and I might have done it 3 times a year. Right. So we sort of self-select that stuff for patients too, and someone who's honest with you about that will self-select you to a specialist who does more of that. The smaller town you're in, the more the general orthopedist will do everything, and they're comfortable with that because that's the practice.
Well, speaking of hip and shoulder, when I was in college taking my exercise science courses, Dr. Armstrong had always emphasized the importance of hip and rotator cuff exercises in preventing injuries of the extremities. What are some exercises that you would recommend for the simple problems that happen in the knees or shoulders?
Yeah. So you mentioned the hip and shoulder first. So let me just quickly touch those, and then we'll go back to the knee. So the main thing for actually as patients age and they want to remain active, the main thing people lose is rotator cuff strength, like you said, and hip balance, the small muscles of the hip. So people do leg press, bicycle, elliptical, all these things. They're in great shape. Their quads and hamstrings are very strong, good for the knees. But they don't work on the small rotators of the hip or the small rotators of the shoulder. So what happens is the bigger muscles are good and the smaller muscles are at disadvantage. So the shoulder, the way it works is the rotator cuff fires first, much smaller muscles. And in the timing of that, the ball centers in its socket, and then it works very smoothly. If they're weaker than the deltoid and the pec and all the bigger muscles, the deltoid and pec and other muscles will overpower them, and the shoulder will not be centered in rotation, and you'll start to get rotator cuff tendonitis. So a lot of people with rotator cuff problems have it primarily because the cuff is weak and the other muscles overpower the cuff. So short arc rotations with a TheraBand, low rows and rotations with a cable machine, those kinds of things to emphasize rotator cuff muscles, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis, those muscles, to be more technical, but the 4 rotator cuff muscles. Before you work on deltoid and trap and pec, that's going to give you a better chance of having less trouble with those, right? With the shoulder. And the hip, if you work on like standing balance exercises, stand on one leg and adduct, move your other leg in and out, stand on the other leg and do that. some people use the cable column with a strap around their thigh and do the standing exercises where you move your leg around standing on one leg and the cable column pulls a little lightweight against the other leg, or the machine where you open your legs and you close the ab and abducting machine where you work on the ab and abductors of the hip. Those will help the hip, right? And hip balance will prevent falls, which will protect your knee and your hip as well, right? So good hip balance prevents fall risk. So that's important. For the knee itself, some people have very tight hamstrings, and stretching hamstrings is good. Some people have done a lot of exercise for quads and done so much that, deep squats and things like that, where they've actually damaged the kneecap with very heavy weights. And then they continue to do those. Sometimes that kneecap damage is a problem longer term. So sometimes you start to look at things like, am I doing stuff that hurts me while I'm doing it? And then can I modify to a painless arc? Do the same exercise in a shorter arc or a different weight or a different style, different form, or change it up completely. Like, you're on the elliptical or you're on a treadmill all the time, and recumbent bike is never used, right? So recumbent bike is less impact load. So maybe you do 10 minutes of one and 10 minutes of another one and 10 minutes of the third one instead of 40 minutes of the same thing. That might balance it out for you and make it easier. So those are my general recommendations for people. Try to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, it's one thing with lifting weights, and particularly with aerobic exercise, most of it is in that very sagittal plane kind of movement as opposed to more in the frontal plane. And I think we lose a lot of that hip rotation and abduction, adduction because we're just not doing the movements.
Right. And the gym, I use a machine. It's kind of interesting. It's called the Octane. There are very few around in the gym. There's like 5 million of every machine. There's only 2 of these in most of the gyms I've been in. And the Octane has pedals, and it's more like ice skating in a way. And the pedal has varying widths. So as you do it, you can have a narrow, like a little bit like an elliptical. It's narrow, and it can go to a width of 10, which is like 1.5 times your shoulder width, where your legs are further out. And as you're exercising, you can vary the width of the stride. And it's more like, cross-country skiing, where you're really pushing off to get up a hill, or ice skating, or it's narrow like it's elliptical, and you vary it as you exercise. And I kind of like that because it forces all kinds of other hip rotations. And if you do it with no hands, it creates a lot of balance exercise from that, because it requires much more balance than a regular elliptical would with no hands. I do recommend that for people too, if they're capable of doing elliptical with no hands. To do that, to work more on balance, because when you add the hands, you're not really working on balance as much, or any of those things.
I'll have to check out that machine. I've never heard of that one before. Sounds like a pretty cool machine.
It's a really interesting, cool machine. Yeah, if you find it, I find it addicting. My trainer says it kills his quads. He doesn't like it.
Okay, well, it's not uncommon for aging adults to experience osteoarthritis and cartilage loss. What recommendations do you have for our listeners dealing with these issues?
So, osteoarthritis is just so common. It's interesting. The pain from osteoarthritis is actually usually more of pressure on the bone below the cartilage and irritation of the lining cells. That's where the pain really comes from. Cartilage surfaces themselves don't really hurt. They don't have much nerve endings, but the bone does. So it's usually a combination of 2 things. It's the cartilage is now wearing, so the cushioning effect of the cartilage is a problem, and the bone is taking too much stress, so you get little stress injuries in the bone. It's sort of like a black eye, right? If you have a black eye, it's all bruised. So inside, if you imagine the bone is bruised underneath, it's going to hurt. So again, the question is, what do you do for that? And anti-inflammatories tend to work acutely. A cortisone shot works. There are other things that have plus-minus effects. People like glucosamine chondroitin. They like, synthetic lubricant, PRP. All these things have mixed results in the studies. And, some people say it's fantastic. Other people say it doesn't work at all. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Again, going to exercises where you're taking that stress away. So, if I find that I'm one of those pounders in the gym and I have osteoarthritis, now maybe I should be doing elliptical or row machine or recumbent bike instead, and not pounding on it all the time. Because, I like to say to my patients, it's funny. It says, look, you got a black eye. And I'm going to do this. For a half hour, I'm just going to punch you in the black eye continuously. And then you tell me how you feel afterwards. Is it going to help or is it going to hurt? I said, what are you, crazy? You're not going to punch me in my black eye. I said, yeah, but you're going to go on the elliptical and make noise for an hour and your knee is killing you. You're just punching yourself in the black eye. It's not going to get better. And I think most people understand that once you say it that way. No pain, no gain is interesting. I love that expression because it's true for muscles. Soreness in the muscles, that soreness stimulates muscle growth, right? But pain in the joint itself, there's not a lot of gain from that. The joint is barking at you because the joint itself is not right. Pushing through that pain doesn't really help the joint. So that's no pain, no gain is different when it comes. If the joint swells after you have the activity, there's definitely no pain, no gain doesn't work there, right?
Right.
Every time you go running and your knee swells, there's something wrong.
So what do our listeners need to know about cartilage transplants?
Well, that is awesome stuff. So there's several types of cartilage transplants, and I would break them into three categories. The first one, let's say four categories. The first one is take cartilage from one spot of your own body and move it to another, right? And that's got a name. It's called oats, and you take a plug from an area that maybe you need a little less, and you move it to a small defect. And there's certain size defects that works for in younger age groups. The second type you hear about is meniscal transplant. So you say, okay, take a frozen cadaver meniscus cartilage and put that in someone who has no meniscus. Again, someone's entire meniscus has been removed for trauma, for other reasons. They're young. The remainder of their cartilage in their knee is quite good. You could put a new meniscus in, and that might spare the knee. Now, it may last 10 years. It may not last longer. The data is mixed on that. But for some people, they've gotten very good results. But it's a big operation, right? The other one is frozen fresh cartilage for a big defect. And I had a young kid once who was in his young 20s and had a motorcycle accident, sheared off a good part of his articular cartilage in his knee. And the defect was so big, I couldn't use his own cartilage. And the defect also involved bone. So I had to wait for a matched cadaver fresh cartilage sample that is the same size knee as his. Because remember, they have to match the curvature. So get an MRI, make a bunch of measurements, send it to the blood bank, the donor bank, and they have to wait for a knee that matches, that's young, and is close to his age. So waited 4 months. It drove his mother and him crazy. It took 4 months to get a match. But we got a match, and I actually plugged it in, and he actually became a Marine, and he's been perfect ever since. It's been an amazing result. They don't always work out that well. It had a giant defect, and it had to be replaced. And the latest type, and so those are the three main types that have been around for a long time. The latest type has been around for about 20 years, but it's been improved for a lot. The technique has gotten a lot better in the last 10. And that is something called MACI, which is, I go into your knee, I see there's a big defect in the surface. The bone underneath is pretty good. The defect is a certain size and has good walls around it, so more like a pothole in the road. But it's a good size that any local graft isn't going to work. And if I did an allograft, it'd be quite big. And I don't need bone, so getting some cadaver bone doesn't make as much sense. I can harvest your own cells, send it to a lab, and get about 5,000 cells out. Take a little sample like a chiclet or a little piece of chewing gum out of your knee. And then they grow it to 10 million cells and impregnate it on collagen matrix. And then we glue it in, and then later it grows your cells. So that's a really fantastic technology. And I've done a few of those over the last 10 years, or 7 years, probably the last 7 years, I've done a few of those. And they have worked out pretty well, but it's a very cool thing, but it requires 2 surgeries. Sometimes requires a third because some people actually overgrow that cartilage. It gets a lot of control and they have to go back and trim it a little bit. It's kind of interesting, but I haven't had that happen to any of my patients, but that's reported in the literature. So you're committing to a long, and the initial recovery requires a fair amount of time of not weight bearing and moving your knee and being very careful with it, because while the matrix is gluing down and starting to grow, you don't want to crush those cells. So it's a tricky thing, but it's amazing at the same time. So if you're willing to buy into the whole tricky part, both technically for me and tricky for the patient, because my part is a few hours, they have to do it for 3 months. if they could do the tricky part for 3 months and are good about it, the results could be quite good. So it's fantastic technology.
Sounds interesting. It sounds like that would be a little bit more long lasting than
some
it's
of
the
a
other
biological.
methods.
Yeah, it would be a biological cure, and if it works and it's your own cells, it theoretically might spare you a knee replacement down the road.
Man, that's cool. Technology,
cool.
how far we've come. That's that's amazing.
Sometimes I do a surgery and I come out and I go, this was just so much fun because it's just so cool that we can do this. There's a thing called root repair, which we're doing more of now, where if you imagine a suspension bridge has cables, right? You guys, big suspension bridges in Oregon, you know what they look like, right? And if you cut the cables at the concrete, the bridge will fall. There's no question it won't support the weight because the cables support most of the weight of the bridge. Well, it turns out inside the meniscus are collagen cables that go around the whole outside edge, and they attach to the bone just like a suspension bridge does. The anchors at either side is the bone end in the front and the back of the knee. So there is a tear that we're much more aware of, again, over the last 10 years, which were never fully appreciated earlier. It's called a root tear, where the cables are actually cut at the bone. You actually tear right at the bone edge, and the cables are effectively cut. And it turns out that is the equivalent of losing the entire meniscus. That even though the meniscus is sitting there and looks pretty good when you look with the scope, the root tear means it's functionally useless. And those people get arthritis rather quickly. Within 3 to 5 years, they get arthritis in their knee in that compartment. So we've started to repair those, which means putting sutures in, looping, locking the edge of the meniscus inside the knee, and then feeding those sutures through a tiny little bone tunnel that's 4 millimeters in diameter, and then anchoring it to the bone on the outside edge so that the meniscus gets pulled into the bone and locked into where it used to be attached at the root. And we roughen the root up a bit and make it bleed so it'll have a chance to heal and all that. And again, if you behave yourself in the first 3 months, it has an excellent chance of healing. And when successful, it saves the meniscus and saves the knee. So it's another very exciting, technically difficult thing to do, but kind of cool. And again, I get kind of excited when I do it because I say, if this works, and again, probably works 90% of the time. If this works, I'm going to save this person from a knee replacement, or at least push it out 5 or 10 years or more. So
well, it almost seems like it's a permanent fix, though, too, since it's their own individual cells that are growing.
Yeah, the cartilage transplant one seems like it would be. We don't have 30-year results. Are they organized the same way as your natural one is, that you're born with? Because there is technically more complicated stuff to talk about, but there's ultrastructure inside the cartilage that is very complex, the way it works and how it gets nutrition going in, because it acts like a sponge. So like you put a sponge in a piece in water and floats, it fills up, right? That water won't move. But if I squeeze the sponge, the water will come out and let go of the sponge, the water goes back in. So when you are active on your knee, the cartilage squeezes ever so slightly when you load it, and then it releases. And that's how nutrients get in and out of the cartilage. So that constant little squeeze and little release is what feeds your cartilage nutrients. Mm-hmm. And there's a very complex mechanism how that all works. But if that's not working right, the cartilage fails. So, we put that cartilage in, it grows, it organizes itself. We don't know yet if it really organizes itself in the best possible way. So we don't know how long that will really last relative to cartilage you're born with. But in theory, it may be very, very good. But it's a lot more complicated question, unfortunately.
You're turning on my inner geek.
Yeah, there you go.
So cool.
Yeah, there's some really cool stuff. So yeah, we're doing very cool things all the time. And then of course, knee replacements and hip replacements are better than ever, and they last a very long time. So if you need those, you shouldn't be afraid of them if you really need it, because it really changes people's quality of life.
Dr. Reznik, you've also written a book on fall risk and prevention titled "I've Fallen and I Can Get Up." Tell us a little bit about the book and how it might help our listeners.
Yeah, that was a recurrent dream. To tell you the story is I used to watch that commercial and cringe as an orthopedic surgeon, because like the poor lady lying on the floor with obvious broken hip and she go, "I've fallen and I can't get up." And I think to myself, this is criminal. We should be teaching people how not to fall. And so I decided, I kept dreaming about this idea. I should write a book, "I've Fallen and I Can Get Up," and be about fall prevention, because just to make fun of the commercial. Probably a terrible idea for the title, because what happens when you Google that title, you always get the commercial. You never get, because Google corrects you. It says it's instead of can get up, it says can't. And it keeps correcting you to can't, and you get the commercials. You can't get my book. So you have to go to my website to find the book. So I'll give you that because it's drreznik.com. It's Drreznik. It's a short 6-letter spelling of Reznik. A lot of people throw a C in there. That doesn't work. So if you do drreznik.com, drreznik.com, you'll find descriptions of both my books there, and you'll be able to get them. But the idea here is that there are so many reasons why people fall, and it comes from head to toe. It's your eyes, your ears, your balance, your proprioception. You know where your hands are. Can you feel your feet? Are your muscles working? Do you have good hip balance? We can go, there's a giant list. And there's medical reasons too. And then there's environmental reasons. So the book kind of goes through all the reasons people fall, and then all the ways to sort out how to prevent it or fix the problems. Because sometimes you're falling because you have an internal problem. There's something wrong. The crystal in the middle of your ear is out of place and your balance is off or something like that. And if you sort those out first and then you get rid of the fall risk, you're not going to be the lady on the floor pushing the button. And that's the whole idea of the book.
All right. Well, Dr. Reznik, we ask this question of all our guests, and so I'm going to ask it of you. What do you do personally to age well?
Well, I do a lot of things. Personally, mentally, I'm always stimulated. I think that's really important. I think, to have, write the book, take a challenge like that, do something that's it's an ongoing project that keeps you driven. Wake up in the morning, go, what am I going to do today? How am I going to fix this problem? Whatever, keep stuff in the forefront of your mind. Try to be sharp in that. So mentally challenge yourself. I think that's very important. And I think some activity all the time. So I stopped running a while ago because that was not a little hard on my body, so running was, I used to run. Then I've switched to biking, kayaking, paddleboarding, and golf. And my biggest dilemma in the summer is is the water calm enough to paddleboard, or is it nice enough out to golf? And I get in my car after the long day of work and there's a little sun left, and I go, oh, where am I going to go? Go to the driving range? I'm going to go get my bike out. That's my big dilemma. So then in the winter when it's cold, I go to the gym. I have a trainer. I try to check in at least once a week if I can with them. If not, I have a stationary bike in the house and I have some weights, and I try to do a little bit of that. And my job is physically demanding. I'm on my feet. I'm running around seeing patients. So I'm moving. As my father used to joke about my grandmother, that she was like the equivalent of a shark. If she wasn't moving and eating, she was probably not alive. So probably that version of that shark that I'm usually moving. I'm usually moving, doing stuff, and I'm moving in two directions. Moving in the direction of staying physically active as best I can with my tight schedule, but also mentally challenging myself with new things.
So, Dr. Reznik, you got your books, you got your orthopedic practice in Connecticut. We also know that you have that website. Now's a good opportunity to say it again so our listeners can find any of the books that they're interested in or just find out more about you.
Yeah, sure. So I have the website. It's drreznik.com. And again, it's Reznik. So drreznik.com. The books are on Barnes and Noble too. You can find them there, and they're on Amazon. So those some people are Amazon Prime members, they'll get the free shipping, and Barnes and Noble will often ship it to the store, and you could pick it up at the store. So you could do it that way. They're also, I think the Knee and Shoulder book has got an ebook too. You can do that. That's also good. If you prefer the ebook version. On the website, I have a lot of videos and free information and stuff for patients. I have a lot of articles I've written about different topics. There's the one about root repair and explains that in a lot of detail. Some different stuff from the book and some interesting surgical videos if you want to learn a little bit about what I do actually in the surgery. There's a way to contact me on the website too if you want an appointment. If you're in the New Haven area, Connecticut, New Haven area, though we do have patients come from further away sometimes. So all that stuff is available online, and it should be pretty easy to find.
Well, great. Well, Dr. Reznik, I really, really appreciate your time. I've learned a lot today and got a lot you've kind of triggered some ideas to learn some more about some of these areas. So I really appreciate your time today. And we'll have to have you back, because I think there were several things that we could have gone down another trajectory had we just asked the right question. And so I think we'll have to have you back at some time. But we just thank you and hope that you will keep aging well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure. Like I said, I'm trying all these different ways to give back the knowledge. After doing it for 34 years, I feel like I've learned a lot on the road, and I don't want it to end there. I want people to gain from it as much as possible. And I think it's an important mission at the end of the day. So thank you for having me. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.